Ever since I was a kid, some games just resonated with me in ways that no other games could. It wasn't about genre-defining mechanics, jaw-dropping graphics, or vivid emotional storytelling. It was something else, something that seemed to register with me on an almost primal level. Well, I think it's about time we took a break from the world of military strategy and talk about one of these other games. Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to take a trip on our little red diesel and travel non-stop to the land of the Transport Tycoon. The 1990s saw the introduction of three absolute titans of the simulation world. Not just excellent games, but games that would define the genre, set the gold standard and pretty much dictate terms to all of the games that tried to follow them. These three games wouldn't be the first in each of their subgenres, and not all of them would even be the first in their individual series. But unlike their predecessors, they had the detail, scope, graphics, sounds and interface to fully accomplish their goals and achieve global acclaim. The first of these is SimCity 2000, the definitive city builder from Maxis, which spawned multiple sequels and the world-shatteringly popular spin-off The Sims. The second of these groundbreakers was Theme Park, a game best known for the fact you could increase the salt content in your fries to sell more soft drinks. Created by Bullfrog and released in 1994, it would be followed up by Theme Hospital, a game so popular that it would be ported to every system imaginable. We're not just talking about Mac and Amiga, we're talking SNES, Mega Drive, PS1 and even the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar. The format of the theme games was copied by many future releases and provided a strong influence on many others. But we are not here to talk about those two games. We're here for the third of these mighty titans, best known as Transport Tycoon Deluxe, or simply TTD to its friends. Originally launched on the 15th of November 94 for MS-DOS, Transport Tycoon was created by Chris Sawyer and published by Microprose. It was marketed as a business sim, focusing on, you guessed it, transport, and it allowed a player to provide rail, road, waterway and air carriage services in a fictional part of what was probably modelled on the United Kingdom. All of the terrain, industry and urban areas were dynamically generated, but the town names had a very English feel to them. All of the vehicles were modelled on their real-world counterparts, so you've got buses, trucks and rolling stock, all from British manufacturers or used by British transport companies. Much of this was easily customisable, with a selection to choose your currency and the side of the road that you want your tiny vehicles to drive on. It was also highly localised. The version you see in the background is very obviously French, as that's the only copy of the original I could get some footage of. The concept itself could not be simpler. Your fledgling company starts with a loan and you're presented with a map full of towns and industries. You spend your initial capital to set up a link between these services. Passengers and mail needs to be moved between the various towns. Coal needs to be shunted from the mines to the power plants, and lumber needs to be hauled from the forests to the sawmills. You use the profits from your first line to fund future development. And as the game progresses and your transport network grows, so do the funds that you have available. These allow you to embark on bigger and better opportunities. Some of the most profitable industries are linked and require more than one connection. Bring iron ore to a mill to produce steel, and then carry that steel to a factory. Also bring in some livestock and grain from a local farm, and then that factory will produce lots of crates of goods, which you can then deliver to the various towns for big profits. If everything goes well, you'll be keeping costs down by sharing a lot of infrastructure. You'll need complicated track arrangements, signals, service depots, and other things like bridges, tunnels and road crossings to make it all work. The faster raw materials are delivered to their destination, the more money you'll get from each trip. And efficiency is important. Vehicles cost money, and the older they get, the more they'll break down and eventually need replacing. Trains, planes, ships and automobiles all have running costs, as do the docks and the ports they require and the very roads and rails they coast on. Here the game is pretty rich in complexity and provides you with many pop-out windows with graphs on profit and loss so you can effectively manage your empire. Chris Sawyer had a pretty novel design concept in mind when he was working on the game. He wanted it to be fun to interact with, but he also wanted it to be fun to just sit back and watch. In the pre-digital era, model railways were pretty popular, and many got a great deal of enjoyment from following each train go about its business. It's partly about the initial setup, but it's also just about watching the motion play out. I guess it's a bit like having an aquarium if you think about it. You start with an empty tank, you add sand and dirt and a whole load of rocks, greenery, sand and perhaps a tiny castle. Then you choose the fish you like and introduce them to the new world. And then, apart from a bit of maintenance and cleaning, you just step back and enjoy whatever happens. You don't control the fish or any of the other little creatures that float about, but you can just watch them go about their daily business. That's the sort of game that Chris wanted to create. Not an intensive or management-heavy complexity puzzle, but something a bit calmer that you could play at your own pace. After watching your road and rail network do its thing for a while, perhaps you'll notice a way to cut delivery times or integrate with a new industry. So you crack open the various UI panels, make your changes, and then you can just sit back again and see how your latest changes all pan out. Transport Tycoon was clearly influenced by other titles, the most notable being Railroad Tycoon from 1990. However, these earlier games are a far cry from the 1994 release. They were graphically very basic and as such nowhere near as satisfying to watch. They still had a great deal of complexity, but the low resolution and poor user interface made them very frustrating to interact with. This resulted in the sort of games where the level of complexity was actually a hindrance to enjoyment. There would always be a small niche that loved these especially fiddly and hard to learn games, but for general audiences it would be very off-putting. One of Transport Tycoon's greatest achievements was to find a way to provide this sort of game in a way that could retain the complexity, but make the interaction simple and easy for both beginners and experienced players alike. There's quite a lot of similarities between this and the great shift that happened to the 4X genre between 91 and 93. 4X games had existed for some years, but they were graphically unimpressive and notoriously difficult to control. When Civilization and Master of Orion hit the shelves, this all changed, and the colourful graphics and intuitive UI opened up the whole genre to a massive new audience. Transport Tycoon did much the same for the world of business simulation. One of the things that I find most impressive is that Chris Sawyer wasn't just the game's designer, but also the sole programmer on the entire project. This was one hell of an achievement in 1994, especially for a game with this level of scope and complexity. These days, solo developers can achieve a lot, but game creation has come a long way, and there now exists a massive array of engines and tools to make the process faster and easier. Chris had access to none of this, and created the entire game in x86 assembly language. As someone who's only ever used high-level languages for his entire career, I can't even imagine how you would put together something like Transport Tycoon entirely in assembly. From a production point of view, there were two others involved. Simon Foster, who created all of the art for the vehicles, buildings and scenery, and John Broomhall, who wrote the soundtrack, which I have to say lives rent-free in my head and has done for the last 30 years. Transport Tycoon was released to great critical acclaim, with scores generally in the 9 out of 10 range. I've not got any details on sales numbers, but with that sort of reception and the longevity, I can only imagine that it did pretty well. Sawyer was also smart enough to employ a pretty savvy business manager, who ensured that he was both properly compensated and retained the rights of his creations. If this is where our story ended, we would have still had a pretty good game on our hands, but Transport Tycoon had yet to reach its final form. There were plenty of features and ideas that never made the final release. This isn't unusual for solo projects, and as such the next steps were pretty much already laid out. An add-on was released called Transport Tycoon Scenario, which included a world editor to allow players to make their own custom maps and scenarios, and included a new Martian tileset and modem play. However, this was just a taste of things to come, and in November 1995, a year after the initial release, Transport Tycoon Deluxe was shipped. More commonly referred to as just TTD, this was to become the definitive version of Transport Tycoon. It featured a big chunk of new additions and addressed many of the shortfalls and limitations of the previous release. It was sold as a standalone product and included the world editor, 3 new gameplay environments and network play. It also included many gameplay upgrades, including an improvement to the signal system, allowing for the creation of more complex rail networks that featured proper junctions and multi-track systems. One of the other major differences was the shift in the timeline. The original game started in 1930 and ended in 2030. Well, it didn't actually end in 2030, but no more new vehicles would be introduced after this time. The Deluxe Edition started in 1950 and ran through to 2050, resulting in a few of the earlier vehicles disappearing altogether, but also seeing the introduction of new technology such as maglev. They also took the opportunity to rename all of the vehicles to avoid trademark issues with the owners of their real-world counterparts. As well as the functional changes, there was also a lot of customization added. Players could rename their vehicles, stations and towns, giving the world a more personal feel. This was a very welcome addition, and established the golden rule that your first coal train must always be called Robbie. Now, Transport Tycoon was an excellent game, but Transport Tycoon Deluxe was simply perfection. The graphics were colourful, fun and unique, the jazz soundtrack piped through the humble MIDI processor and superbly suited the action. And most importantly, the level of complexity and detail was in the absolute sweet spot of enough to engage with but not too much to frustrate. I think the strongest proof of any of this is that you can sit there for hours without the need to be nudged along by objectives or gamified progression. There are no quests, no achievements, and the only points you have to worry about are the ones on your railway sidings. You play the game because you play games for fun, and this game is fun to play. That might seem like a dumb thing to say, but honestly, these days I think that's something that a lot of developers seem to forget. There is immense satisfaction in building up various road and rail networks, and then watching all of the trains and trucks beetle about as they go about their business. It's such an excellent example of solid design, and I think it should be regarded as the gold standard of what features any good sim game needs, and what features just add levels of additional complexity that don't really improve the game at all. You have to remember, all features cost development time, and for every pointless feature that you add, that's another important feature you must neglect to improve or leave on the cutting room floor. If someone created a game like Transport Tycoon today, you know the first thing they would add is an in-depth system of research and development. You would have a long list of unlockables with various forks and paths that required spending cash and accomplishing various tasks to grant access to them. You would be researching premium diesel that granted you 3% reliability and 4% top speed, and bus improvements that squeezed in an extra seat between the driver and the luggage compartment. This system would create a lot of pointless busywork that got in the way of the core game mechanic of building networks and watching little steam trains puff themselves way across the map. Transport Tycoon has none of this. You get the BR standard Class 8 steam locomotive in 1954, not because you completed a coal delivery achievement and put science points into Steam, but because that's the year it was built. You're not in the business of inventing, you're in the business of transport, so as far as the game is concerned, anything outside of that is irrelevant to its objectives. The game is set in the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st. It's not the world of the rail barons of the 1800s, and as such, other people do the design and production of your rolling stock. This is what makes Transport Tycoon such a tight ship. It focuses on the stuff that really matters to you as a transport tycoon, like bridges, signals and tunnels, as well as bribing local town officials to grant you exclusive cargo rights. Graphically, Transport Tycoon is one of those few games that has managed an almost timeless quality. It looked great in 1995, and 30 years on it still looks just as good. I'm sure it could all be redrawn and animated in perfect 3D with high-resolution textures, dynamic lighting and shadows and reflections, but in all honesty, I don't think that would make it look any better. It looks very charming. Everything you need to interact with is immediately recognisable, and it's very easy on the eyes. I think this is one of the main reasons that the game has endured for so long. From a certain point of view, Transport Tycoon Deluxe was not the end of the series. 10 years on, Chris Sawyer would release Locomotion. It's labelled as a spiritual successor due to boring reasons involving intellectual property rights, but because it was solely designed and developed by Chris Sawyer, I think it's as close to an official follow-up as you can get. Locomotion was not to see the same sort of success. Games had come a long way in the decade since Transport Tycoon was released, but unfortunately Locomotion did not reflect these improvements. Critical reviews were unkind, although it's worth noting that most of these negative reviews were focused on the art and the visuals rather than the gameplay itself. However, the problems with the controls and interface did also receive a lot of attention. This is the problem with trying to follow up Transport Tycoon. It's almost impossible to rival perfection. This wasn't a case of the difficult second album syndrome. Chris Sawyer had created games since, including the Roller Coaster Tycoon series, which was even more popular than Transport Tycoon. A solo designer and developer creating a game that sold more than 6 million copies is nothing short of spectacular. Unfortunately, game development had changed a lot since the 90s and Sawyer was still very much stuck in the old way of doing things. That's not my criticism, but his own. During an interview in 2016, he said that the world of games moved on and I didn't. He loved the flawed style and clunky simplicity of games from that era, and he was perfectly in his zone, working solo, writing in assembly and able to have complete creative control to realise his own visions. I've got a huge amount of respect for Chris Sawyer, and I get the impression that he viewed game creation in the same way that an author would approach the writing of a novel. You would have some assistants, perhaps an editor, and maybe an illustrator too, but the primary output was the result of your own creativity and skill. You had the ideas, you knew what you wanted to create, and it was your job to do it in a way that satisfied your vision. You alone would shoulder the responsibility of the end result, whether it be great success, abject failure, or anything and everything in between. I think this large shift is probably the reason that he stepped back from the industry after Locomotion to focus on other endeavours. He would return for a short while to port some of his older games to mobile platforms, but after that he would continue his indefinite hiatus. I get the impression that he did well enough out of his successes and the continued royalties from the IPs that he licenses that he doesn't feel the need to return to an industry that's almost unrecognisable from the one that he left. He now spends his time on the things that matter to him, his friends, his family and his local community. Other production teams still release games that bear the Tycoon name, but he doesn't get involved. He's very grounded in this way. Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 and 2 were his creative vision, but the 9 other games that bore the name since are not. He might own the IP, but he doesn't try to throw his weight around to make them in his image. The way he sees it is that these games are someone else's creative vision, and it's up to them to make them in such a way that they feel fit. Yes, he licenses out the IP, and I'm sure financially he's done pretty well out of it, but he doesn't try to act as its gatekeeper or overseer. This here is what I think is the real success story. Many who were once developers in the business of creation ended up staying in the industry. They moved on to be designers, and then owners in small studios, and finally CEOs in the vast megacorps that those studios became. They sure earn a pretty penny, but they spend every waking hour in board meetings, arguing with other executives about how to squeeze more money out of microtransactions or what day of the month to release Call of Duty 36 on. But Chris? He travels around the world looking for new roller coasters to try. As of last year, his total was pushing 800. I can't help but feel that he's chosen the smarter path. Thankfully, for those that love Transport Tycoon, there are others out there that love it even more, and as such we can still play it to this day. Released in March 2004 and still in active development, OpenTTD is the way to play Transport Tycoon in the modern era. It's an absolutely faithful recreation of the deluxe version, although with a few fantastic improvements that make it an absolute joy. It uses its own community-created graphics, effects and music that does not infringe on any intellectual property rights, but it also allows you to copy some files from your original CD to get that authentic Transport Tycoon look and feel. Much of the footage I've captured for use in this video is from OpenTTD, albeit with the original files from the Windows install. But even if you don't have access to these, the open source versions are thematically matched. And although they trigger a little less nostalgia, they're still very suitable and a joy to use. Let's switch over to them now. Still pretty good, eh? OpenTTD is one of the best open source game recreation projects ever to be envisaged, and the new features allow you to experience the game in ways you never could before, including massive maps and multiplayer games with support for 255 players. I think it's fair to say that if you want to play Transport Tycoon, then OpenTTD is the way to do it, and it's available for free and just a quick install away. It even got a Steam release a few years back, so there really is no excuse. As you can probably tell, I love Transport Tycoon. I loved it 30 years ago when I was a kid, and I still love it today. It's an amazing combination of gameplay, features and setting that provides a deeply satisfying experience that goes far beyond nostalgia. I don't play Transport Tycoon in 2025 because I loved it in my youth or because it reminds me of a simpler time. I play it because it's an absolutely excellent game that managed to achieve a perfect balance between all of the elements required for a great isometric sim. It's a true masterpiece, and because of the amazing vision and work of Sawyer, the timeless graphics by Foster and the classic soundtrack by Broomhall, and all of the great work by the OpenTTD team, I can just fire it up any time and send Robbie rolling down the track, heading non-stop to the mines while Little Red Diesel chimes cheerfully from my headset. Hi there. Thanks for letting me divert from my usual military track and talk about some business strategy. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button, and if you were also deeply affected by this game, then let me know in a comment or in the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.